Loki the betrayer. He stole Frigga's dress of falcon feathers. Then, as a falcon, he flew out of Asgard. Jotunheim was the place that he flew towards. The anger and fierceness of the hawk was within Loki as he flew through the giant's realm. The heights and the chasms of that dread land made his spirits mount up like fire. He saw the whirlpools in the smoking mountains and had joy of these sights. Higher and higher he soared until, looking towards the south, he saw the flaming land of Muspelheim. Higher and higher still he soared. With his falcon's eyes he saw the gleaming of Surtur's flaming sword. All the fire of Muspelheim and all the gloom of Jotunheim would one day be brought against Asgard and against Midgard. But Loki was no longer dismayed to think of the ruin of Asgard's beauty and the ruin of Midgard's promise. He hovered around one of the dwellings in Jotunheim. Why had he come to it? Because he had seen 2 of the women of that dwelling, and his rage against the Aesir and the Vanir was so great that the ugliness and the evil of these women was pleasing to him. He hovered before the open door of the giant's house, and he looked upon those who were within. Geirrod, the most savage of all the giants, was there, and beside him, squatting on the ground, were his 2 evil and ugly daughters, Gelp and Greep. They were big and rugged, with horse's teeth and hair that was like a horse's mane. Gelp was the ugliest of the 2, if one could be said to be uglier than the other, for her nose was a yard long and her eyes were crooked. What were they talking about as they sat there, one scratching the other? Of Asgard and the dwellers in Asgard, whom they hated. Thor was the one whom they hated most of all, and they were speaking of all they would like to do with him. I would keep Thor bound in chains, said Geirrod the giant, and I would then beat him to death with my iron club. I would grind his bones to powder, said Greep. I would tear his bones, said Gelp. Father, can you not catch this Thor and bring him to us alive? Not as long as he has his hammer Mjolnir, and the gloves with which he grasps his hammer, and the belt that doubles his strength. Oh, if we could just catch him without his hammer and his belt and his gloves, cried Gelp and Greep together. At that moment they saw the falcon hovering before the door. They were eager now for something to hold and torment, and so the hearts of the 3 became set upon catching the falcon. They did not stir from the place where they were sitting, but they called the child Glap, who was swinging from the roof tree, and they bade him go out and try to catch the falcon. All concealed by great leaves, the child Glap climbed up the ivy that was around the door. The falcon came hovering near. Then Glap caught it by the wings and fell down through the ivy, screaming and struggling as he was being beaten and clawed and torn by the wings and the talons and the beak of the falcon. Geirrod and Greep and Gelp rushed out and kept hold of the falcon. As the giant held him in his hands and looked him over, he knew this was no bird creature. The eye showed him to be of Alfheim or Asgard. The giant took him and shut him in a box till he would speak. Soon he tapped at the closed box, and when Geirrod opened it, Loki spoke to him. So glad was the savage giant to have one of the dwellers in Asgard in his power, that he and his daughters did nothing but laugh and chuckle to each other for days. And all this time they left Loki in the closed box to waste with hunger. When they opened the box again, Loki spoke to them. He told them he would do any injury to the dwellers in Asgard that would please them if they would just let him go. Will you bring Thor to us? Said Greep. Will you bring Thor to us without his hammer and without the gloves with which he grasped his hammer and without his belt? Said Gelp. I will bring him to you if you will let me go, Loki said. Thor is easily deceived, and I can bring him to you without his hammer and his belt and his gloves. "We will let you go, Loki," said the giant, "if you will swear by the gloom of Jotunheim that you will bring Thor to us as you say." Loki swore that he would do so by the gloom of Jotunheim. "Yea, and by the fires of Muspelheim," he added. The giant and his daughters let him go, and he flew back to Asgard. He restored to Frigga her falcon dress. All blamed him for having stolen it, but when he told how he had been shut up without food in Geirrod's dwellings, those who judged him thought he had been punished enough for the theft. He spoke as before to the dwellers in Asgard, and the rage and hatred he had against them since he had eaten Gullveig's heart he kept from bursting forth. He talked to Thor of the adventures they had together in Jotunheim. Thor would now roar with laughter when he talked of the time when he went as a bride to Thrym the giant. Loki was able to persuade him to make another journey to Jotunheim. "And I want to speak to you of what I saw in geirrod's dwelling," he said. "I saw there the hair of Sif, your wife." "The hair of Sif, my wife?" said Thor in surprise. "Yes, the hair I once cut off from Sif's head," said Loki. "Geirrod was the one who found it when I cast it away. They light their hall with Sif's hair. Oh yes, they don't need torches where Sif's hair is." "I should like to see it," said Thor. "Then pay Geirrod a visit," Loki replied. "But if you go to his house, you will have to go there without your hammer Mjolnir and without your gloves and your belt." "Where will I leave Mjolnir and my gloves and my belt?" Thor asked. "Leave them in Valaskjalf, Odin's own dwelling," said cunning Loki. "Leave them there, and come to Geirrod's dwelling. Surely you will be treated well." "Yes, I will leave them in Valaskjalf, and I will go with you to Geirrod's dwelling," Thor said. Thor left his hammer, his gloves, and his belt in Odin's dwelling. Then he and Loki went towards Jotunheim. When they were near the end of their journey, they came to a wide river, and with a young giant whom they had met on the bank, they began to ford it. Suddenly the river began to rise. Loki and the young giant would have been swept away, only Thor gripped both of them. Higher and higher the river rose, and rougher it became. Thor had to plant his feet firmly on the bottom, or he and the two he held would have been swept down by the flood. He struggled across, holding Loki and the young giant. A mountain ash grew out of the bank, and while the two held to him, he grasped it with his hands. The river rose still higher, but Thor was able to draw Loki and the young giant to the bank, and then he himself scrambled up on it. Now looking up the river, he saw a sight that filled him with rage. A giantess was pouring a flood into it. This it was that was making the river rise and seethe. Thor pulled a rock out of the bank and hurled it at her. It struck her and flung her into the flood. Then she struggled out of the water and went yelping away. This giantess was Jelp, Geirrod's ugly and evil daughter. Nothing would do the young giant whom Thor had helped across, but that the boar would go and visit Grid, his mother, who lived in a cave in the hillside. Loki would not go, and was angered to hear that Thor thought of going. But Thor, seeing that the giant youth was friendly, was willing enough to go to Grid's dwelling. "Go then, but get soon to Geirrod's dwelling yonder. I will wait for thee there," said Loki. He watched Thor go up the hillside to Grid's cave. He waited until he saw Thor come back down the hillside and go towards Geirrod's dwelling. He watched Thor go into the house where, as he thought, death awaited him. Then, in a madness for what he had done, Loki, with his head drawn down on his shoulders, started running like a bird along the ground. Grid, the old giantess, was seated on the floor of the cave, grinding corn between two stones. "Who is it?" she said, as her son led Thor within. "One of the Aesir. What giant do you go to injure now, Asa Thor?" "I go to injure no giant, old Grid," Thor replied. "Look upon me. Cannot you see I have not Mjolnir, my mighty hammer, with me, nor my belt, nor my gloves of iron?" "But where in Jotunheim do you go?" "To the house of a friendly giant, old Grid, to the house of Geirrod." "Geirrod, a friendly giant? You are out of your wits, Asa Thor. Is he not out of his wits, my son? This one who saved you from the flood, as you say?" "Tell him of Geirrod, old mother," said the giant youth. "Do not go to his house, Asa Thor. Do not go to his house." "My word has been given, and I shall be a coward if I stayed away now, just because an old crone sitting at a grindstone tells me I am going into a trap. I will give you something that will help you, Asa Thor. Lucky for you, I am mistress of magical things. Take this staff in your hands. It is a staff of power, and will stand you instead of Mjolnir." "I will take it, since you offer it in kindness, old dame. I will take this worm-eaten staff. And take these mittens, too. They will serve you for your gauntlets of iron." "I will take them, since you offer them in kindness, old dame. I will take these worn old mittens. And take this length of string. It will serve you for your belt of prowess." "I will take it, since you offer it in kindness, old dame. I will take this ragged length of string." "'Tis well indeed for you, Asa Thor, that I am a mistress of magical things." Thor put the worn length of string around his waist, and as he did so he knew that Grid, the old giantess, was indeed the mistress of magical things, for immediately he felt his strength augmented as when he put on his own belt of strength. He then drew on the mittens and took the staff that she gave him. He left the cave of Grid, the old giantess, and went to Geirrod's dwelling. Loki was not there. It was then that Thor began to think that perhaps old Grid was right, and that a trap was being laid for him. No one was in the hall. He came out of the hall and into a great stone chamber, and he saw no one there either. But in the center of the stone chamber there was a stone seat, and Thor went to it and seated himself upon it. No sooner was he seated than the chair flew upwards. Thor would have been crushed against the stone roof only that he held his staff up. So great was the power in the staff, so great was the strength that the string around him gave, that the chair was thrust downwards. The stone chair crashed down upon the stone floor. There were horrible screams from under it. Thor lifted up the seat and saw two ugly, broken bodies there. The giant's daughters, Jelp and Greep, had hidden themselves under the chair to watch his death. But the stone that was to have crushed him against the ceiling had crushed them against the floor. Thor strode out of that chamber with his teeth set hard. A great fire was blazing in the hall, and standing beside that fire he saw Geirrod, the long-armed giant. He held a tongs into the fire. As Thor came towards him, he lifted up the tongs and flung from it a blazing wedge of iron. It whizzed straight towards Thor's forehead. Thor put up his hands and caught the blazing wedge of iron between the mittens that old Grid had given him. Quickly he hurled it back at Geirrod. It struck the giant on the forehead and went blazing through him. Geirrod crashed down into the fire, and the burning iron made a blaze all around him. And when Thor reached Grid's cave, he went there to restore to the old giantess the string, the mittens, and the staff of power she had given him. He saw the giant's dwelling in such a blaze that one would think the fires of Muspelheim were all around it.